The fire came at midnight, and it did not care who it burned. Inside the royal nursery of the wolf realm, a woman named Mirella pressed a crying infant against her chest and ran through smoke thick enough to choke a grown wolf. Behind her, the sound of steel meeting steel echoed through the stone halls. The king was dead, the queen was dead, only the baby remained, and Mirella had sworn with her last breath that this child would live. She did not stop running until she reached the old drainage tunnel beneath the palace, a passage few remembered and fewer still could find. Water dripped from the ceiling as she pressed a trembling hand to the infant's forehead and whispered words that had been passed down through generations of healers, words meant to hide, to protect, to erase. The baby's eyes, which had glowed faint gold only moments before, dimmed to an ordinary brown. "You will not remember this night," Mirella whispered, tears cutting clean lines through the soot on her cheeks. "You will not remember who you are, but somewhere inside you, your blood will remember for you." She wrapped the child in a servant's blanket, stripped away anything that marked her as royal, and carried her through the night to the border village of Hollow Creek, far from the reach of the men who had murdered a king to steal his throne. There, she left the baby on the doorstep of a childless couple, along with a single silver coin bearing the mark of a howling wolf beneath a crescent moon. Then Mirella turned back toward the palace, back toward the smoke and the screaming, because someone needed to slow down the men who were hunting for survivors. She never returned. The couple who found the baby named her Elira, and they loved her as their own for exactly 4 years, until sickness took them both within the same winter. After that, Elira passed from house to house, working for her food, sleeping in barns and kitchens, growing up fast in a world that had no patience for orphans. By the time she turned 20, Elira had learned to expect nothing from anyone. She worked from before sunrise until long after dark in the house of a bitter woman named Greta, who ran a laundry business in the lower town and treated every servant like a mule that happened to speak. Elira's hands were rough from scrubbing, her back ached from carrying, and her stomach growled more often than it was filled. But there were 2 things about her that no amount of hardship could explain. The first was her strength. She could lift loads that should have crushed her thin frame, carry water barrels that took 2 grown men to budge, and once, without thinking, she had bent an iron gate hinge back into place with her bare hands after it rusted shut. She always hid this. A servant girl who was stronger than she should be attracted the wrong kind of attention. The second was her eyes. In ordinary daylight they were plain brown, unremarkable, easy to overlook. But on nights when the moon rose full and bright, if she caught her reflection in still water, her eyes shimmered gold, like 2 small suns trapped beneath dark lashes. She had never told a single soul about this. She barely let herself think about it, because thinking about it meant asking questions she had no answers to, and questions like that had a way of getting a poor girl in trouble. She did not know she was the last living heir to the Wolf Realm's throne. She did not know that 20 miles away, in the capital city of Emberfall, the pack she had been born to protect was still ruled by fear, still waiting for a princess who was believed to be ashes in a burned nursery. All Elira knew was hunger and work and the small, stubborn hope that someday her life would be more than scrubbing another woman's linens. That hope arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in the shape of a notice pinned to the board outside the market square. The royal palace was hiring kitchen staff. Wages were modest but steady, and workers were given a bed and 2 meals a day, which was more than Greta had ever offered. Elira read the notice 3 times before she let herself believe it was real, then walked the entire distance to Emberfall on foot, her only pair of shoes falling apart by the time she arrived. The palace of Emberfall rose out of the northern hills like something carved by giants, its towers wrapped in dark stone, and its gates guarded by wolves in human form, tall men and women with sharp eyes, who watched every visitor the way a hunter watches a rabbit. Elira had heard stories about the palace her whole life, whispered over washing basins and market stalls. She had heard about the Alpha King most of all. King Draven had ruled the Wolf Realm for nearly 6 years, since he was barely more than a young man himself, thrown onto the throne after his father and the royal family before him were slaughtered in what the histories called the Ember Coup. Draven had fought that night, fought with a ferocity that had become legend, and in doing so, he lost his sight. A blade meant for his throat had instead raked across his eyes, and though healers saved his life, they could not save his vision. For most alphas, blindness would have meant the end of their rule. Among wolves, strength and dominance were everything, and a leader who could not see his enemies coming was considered easy prey. But Draven had refused to be pitied or replaced. He learned to fight by sound and scent alone, sharpened his other senses until he could hear a lie in someone's heartbeat and smell fear rolling off a man from across a room. He ruled with an iron will that made even his critics fall silent, though those same critics whispered behind closed doors that a blind king could not last forever. Alira knew none of the political details when she arrived at the palace gates. She only knew that she needed the job, and she was prepared to work harder than anyone else to keep it. The head cook, a stout woman named Bettina, with flour permanently dusted into the lines of her hands, looked Alira over with a critical eye. "You're skinny," Bettina said. "Can you carry a full stew pot without spilling it?" "Yes," Alira said, and to prove it, she lifted the heaviest pot in the kitchen with one arm, holding it steady without so much as a wobble. Bettina's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Well then, welcome to the palace kitchens. Don't steal, don't gossip about the royal family, and stay out of the West Wing unless you're told to go there. That's where the king keeps his private study, and he does not like surprises." Alira nodded, tucking the warning away, though she had no intention of wandering anywhere near a king who could apparently smell a lie from across a courtyard. She had come here to work, to eat, to sleep somewhere dry. She had not come here looking for trouble, and she certainly had not come here looking for a king. But trouble, as it turned out, had a way of finding people whether they looked for it or not. Her first week passed in a blur of chopping vegetables, scrubbing pots, and learning the maze of hallways that made up the palace kitchens and servants' quarters. She kept her head down, spoke only when spoken to, and earned quiet praise from Bettina for her speed and her willingness to take on extra tasks that other servants avoided. It was during her second week that everything changed. Late one evening, after the kitchen had gone quiet and most of the staff had retired for the night, Alira was sent to deliver a tray of tea to the private study in the West Wing, the very place Bettina had warned her about. The servant who usually carried out this task had fallen ill, and there was no one else available. "Just knock, leave the tray on the small table by the door, and go," Bettina instructed, wringing her hands with obvious nerves. "Do not speak, unless he speaks first. Do not stare. He will know if you stare, somehow, even though he cannot see you. Just go quickly, and quietly." Alira balanced the tray carefully as she walked down the long corridor toward the West Wing, her heart beating a little faster with every step. The hallway grew darker and colder the further she went, lit only by scattered torches that cast long shadows against the stone walls. She had never been so close to where the king actually lived and worked, and despite Bettina's warnings, she felt a flicker of curiosity she couldn't quite smother. She found the study door slightly ajar, a thin line of candlelight spilling out into the hallway. She knocked softly, the way she had been told, and waited. "Enter," came a voice from inside, low and steady, carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire corridor without needing to be raised. Alira pushed the door open with her hip, careful not to spill the tray, and stepped inside. The study was smaller than she expected, lined with shelves of books that seemed almost decorative, given their owner could not read them. A large desk sat near the center of the room, and behind it sat the king. He was younger than she had imagined, though the stories about him had never mentioned his age, only his ferocity. His dark hair was pushed back from his face, and even in the dim candlelight, she could see the faint silver scars that crossed both his eyes, evidence of the wound that had taken his sight. He sat with perfect posture, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something only he could hear. "You're not Nessa," he said, before she had even set the tray down. Alira froze. "No, my lord. Nessa is unwell tonight. I was sent in her place." "New," he said, not a question, simply an observation. "Your footsteps are different, lighter, but you carry more weight than most kitchen staff. What's your name?" She hesitated, unused to being addressed so directly by anyone, let alone a king. "Alira, my lord." "Alira," he repeated, as though testing the shape of the word. "Set the tray down, Alira. Not where Nessa usually places it. She always leaves it too close to the edge of the table, and I've spilled tea on important documents more times than I care to admit." Despite her nerves, Alira almost smiled. She set the tray carefully in the center of the small table, well away from any edge. "Is this better, my lord?" "Much," He turned his head toward her, and though his eyes could not see her, she had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that he was studying her all the same. "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question either, but Alira answered honestly, because she couldn't think of a reason to lie. "I don't know you well enough to be afraid of you, my lord. Everyone else seems to be afraid because of stories, not because of anything you've actually done to them." A long silence followed, and Alira wondered if she had overstepped, if she had just made the worst mistake of her short time at the palace. But then, unexpectedly, the king let out a short, surprised laugh, low and rough, as though he hadn't used the sound in some time. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in this room in 6 years. You may go, Alira. Thank you for the tea." She left the study with her pulse racing, unsure whether she had just charmed the Alpha King of the Wolf Realm or committed an unforgivable breach of etiquette. She did not know, walking back through those dark corridors, that she had just taken the first step down a path that would change everything she thought she knew about herself, about her past, and about the destiny that had been waiting for her since the night a nursemaid carried her out of a burning palace and into the arms of strangers. She only knew that for the first time and longer than she could remember, someone had looked past her ragged clothes and her lowered eyes, and had actually listened to what she had to say, even if that someone couldn't see her at all. The days that followed brought no repeat summons to the West Wing, and Alira told herself that was for the best. A servant girl had no business drawing the attention of a king, blind or otherwise, and she returned to her routine of kitchen work with something like relief. She scrubbed pots, hauled water, and listened to the other servants gossip about court matters she barely understood. Foreign lords visiting from neighboring pacts, council meetings that ran late into the night, whispers of unrest among certain noble families who felt the king's rule had grown too soft since his injury. She learned, in bits and pieces overheard between kitchen tasks, that the king's council pressed him constantly about the matter of his marriage. A king without an heir was a vulnerability, they said, an opening for rivals to exploit. Several noble daughters had been suggested as potential brides over the years. Each proposal met with the same flat refusal from the throne room. Draven, it seemed, had no interest in marrying a stranger chosen for political convenience. Alira found herself thinking about the king more often than she wanted to admit, replaying that strange, brief conversation in her mind while she worked. She told herself it meant nothing, that a single unusual exchange with a lonely, blind ruler did not make her special or important in any way. And yet, some part of her, the part that occasionally caught gold flickering in her own reflection under moonlight, wondered if there was more to her life than she had ever been allowed to see. 2 weeks passed before Nessa fell ill again, this time with a lingering cough that kept her confined to her bed for nearly a fortnight. Bettina, without any other options, assigned Alira to carry the king's evening tray each night, a task Alira accepted with an outward show of reluctance and an inward flutter of curiosity she refused to name. Each evening followed a similar pattern. She would knock, he would call her in, and a brief exchange would follow, sometimes only a few words, sometimes stretching into a longer conversation about the weather, the state of the palace gardens, or some minor complaint about a councilman who talked too much and said too little. Draven never once treated her the way the other nobles treated servants, as furniture that happened to move on command. He asked her questions. He listened to her answers, actually listened, in a way that made her feel, for the first time in her entire life, like her opinions mattered to someone. One evening, nearly a month after their first meeting, Draven asked her to describe the palace gardens to him. "I remember what they looked like, before," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of something like longing. "But it's been 6 years. I imagine the roses have changed. Tell me what you see." Alira had never been asked to describe anything before, and the request caught her off guard. She thought for a moment, then began, carefully, to paint a picture with words. The deep red roses climbing the stone archway near the eastern fountain, the way the evening light turned the fountain's spray into tiny scattered jewels, the old oak tree at the garden's edge where sparrows nested every spring. Draven listened with his head tilted, utterly still, as though he were standing in the garden himself rather than sitting behind a desk in a dimly lit study. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "No one has described anything to me like that since I lost my sight. Most people simply tell me things are fine, or beautiful, or unchanged, as though those words mean anything at all." From that night forward, Their evening conversations grew longer, and Alira found herself looking forward to them with an eagerness she couldn't quite justify to herself. She was, after all, still a poor kitchen servant, and he was still the most powerful man in the entire wolf realm. Nothing about their positions in life should have allowed for anything resembling friendship, let alone anything more. But fate, it seemed, cared very little for the rules that governed kings and servants, and the threads of Alira's forgotten past were already beginning to pull tight around her, drawing her steadily toward a truth that would upend everything she believed about who she was, and who she was always meant to become. The council chamber of Emberfall was a cold, imposing room, ringed with tall windows and lined with the carved emblems of every noble house in the wolf realm. On the morning the trouble truly began, King Draven sat at the head of a long stone table, his fingers drumming a slow, patient rhythm against the armrest of his chair, while Lord Corwin Ashgrave's voice filled the room like smoke filling a sealed box. 6 years, my king, Corwin was saying, his tone smooth and reasonable, in the way of a man who had practiced sounding reasonable for a very long time. 6 years, without an heir, without a queen, without any assurance to this realm that the throne will remain stable should anything happen to you. The northern packs grow restless, they ask questions I cannot answer forever. And what would you have me do, Corwin? Draven asked, his voice calm, though those who knew him well could hear the tightness beneath it. Marry a stranger simply because her father owns land bordering mine? I would have you marry someone, Corwin said. Lady Fenwick of the Eastern Territories has expressed clear interest. Her pack is strong, loyal, and her bloodline is impeccable. It would be a wise match, politically speaking. Politics, Draven repeated, the word flat and unimpressed. I have ruled this realm through fire and loss, including the loss of my own eyes, Corwin. I think I have earned the right to choose my own wife, rather than accept whichever noble daughter you and the council decide is most convenient. Murmurs rippled around the table, some in agreement with the king, others clearly siding with Corwin's practical concerns. Lady Wynne, an older councilwoman who had served under 3 different rulers, cleared her throat. With respect, my king, the council does not question your right to choose. We question the wisdom of delay. A realm without a clear line of succession is a realm vulnerable to those who would exploit that uncertainty. Draven said nothing for a long moment, his sightless eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as though he were looking through the walls of the chamber, toward something only he could sense. Then, without warning, he stood, and the room fell silent. I will marry, he said, before the next full moon, and I will choose my bride myself, without further debate from this council. The chamber erupted into a flurry of questions, but Draven simply turned and walked out, guided by nothing more than the familiar echo of his own footsteps against stone, leaving behind a room full of stunned nobles, who had no idea what had just been decided, and no idea that the king himself barely knew either. That evening, when Alira arrived with his tea tray, she found him unusually quiet, seated by the window of his study, though he could not see the sunset painting the sky beyond it. You're troubled tonight, my lord, she said, setting the tray down carefully in its usual spot. The council wants me married, Draven said, without preamble. They've wanted it for years, but today I told them I would do it before the next full moon. Alira's stomach twisted in a way she didn't fully understand. And who will you marry? Draven turned his face toward her voice, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, as though weighing something heavy in his mind. I haven't decided, he said finally. Every noble daughter they parade before me wants the crown, not the man wearing it. They speak to my title and my land, never to me. Maybe, Alira said carefully, you should choose someone who speaks to you instead. Would you? He asked, and the question landed so suddenly, so directly, that Alira nearly dropped the empty tray in her hands. My lord, I'm a servant. I carry your tea. I don't understand what you're asking. I'm asking, Draven said, rising from his chair and crossing the room toward her, with the sure, careful steps of a man who had memorized every inch of his own study, whether you would speak to me, and only me, if I asked you to be my wife. The silence that followed felt enormous, stretching between them like a held breath. Alira's mind raced through 1,000 reasons why this was impossible. Why a king could not simply marry a kitchen servant. Why the entire court would revolt against such a scandalous choice. Why she herself barely understood the strange pull she felt toward this man who could not even see her face. "You don't know me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know anything about my past, my family, where I came from." "I know you," Draven said, and there was something fierce and certain in his voice now. "I know the sound of your footsteps and the honesty in your voice. I know you've never once lied to me, not even small lies to make me feel better, the way everyone else in this palace does. I know more about who you truly are than I know about any noble woman who has ever stood before me, dripping in jewels and empty flattery." Illyra's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it, given his heightened senses. "This is madness," she whispered. "The council will never accept a marriage like this." "The council," Draven said, "does not sit on this throne. I do, and I have decided." He reached out, his hand finding her face with surprising gentleness, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, as though committing her features to memory through touch alone, since sight would never allow it. Illyra stood frozen, caught between disbelief and something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Marry me, Illyra," Draven said softly. "Not because the council demands an heir, not because it will silence Corwin's endless complaints. Marry me, because for the first time in 6 years of darkness, I feel like I actually sense something real when I'm near you." Tears gathered in Illyra's eyes before she could stop them, and though every practical part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that a servant girl marrying a king could only end in disaster, her heart answered before her thoughts could catch up. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." The announcement that followed shook the entire wolf realm to its foundations. Word spread through Emberfall like wildfire, from the palace halls down to the lowest taverns in the poorest districts, and reactions varied wildly depending on who was asked. The common folk, for the most part, found the story wonderfully romantic, a blind king choosing love over political convenience, a poor servant girl swept into royal life. The nobility, however, was far less charmed. Corwin Ashgrave received the news with a carefully controlled expression that gave nothing away, though privately, in the solitude of his own chambers, he seethed with a fury that had less to do with propriety and more to do with a secret he had guarded for over 20 years. A secret that suddenly felt far more dangerous than it had the week before. Lady Wynne, though surprised, kept her thoughts to herself, choosing instead to observe quietly from the edges of the court, watching this unusual servant girl with the sharp, patient eyes of a woman who had learned long ago that appearances rarely told the whole truth. Illyra herself barely had time to process the enormity of what had happened before she found herself swept into a whirlwind of preparation. Palace tailors arrived within the day to measure her for a wedding gown finer than anything she had ever imagined touching, let alone wearing. Attendants who had once ignored her presence in the kitchen now curtsied when she passed, their expressions a strange mixture of respect and poorly hidden resentment. Bettina, of all people, took the news with tears of genuine joy, hugging Illyra so tightly she nearly lifted her off the ground. "I knew there was something different about you the moment you walked into my kitchen," the older woman said, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. "Strong as an ox and honest as a summer morning. The king has chosen well, whatever those old nobles whisper behind their fancy fans." But not everyone shared Bettina's enthusiasm, and Illyra quickly learned that palace life came with dangers far more subtle than physical labor. Noble ladies who had once hoped to become queen themselves regarded her with barely concealed contempt, whispering behind gloved hands whenever she passed through the corridors. Some questioned her lineage openly, demanding to know what family, however humble, had produced a girl bold enough to catch a king's eye. Illyra had no answers for them, only the truth that she had been an orphan, raised by strangers, with no family name to offer, no dowry, nothing but herself. Through it all, Draven remained steady and unmoved by the gossip swirling around them, his confidence in his choice never wavering, even as pressure mounted from every corner of his court. In the quiet hours of the evening, away from prying eyes and whispered criticisms, he and Illyra continued their now familiar ritual of conversation, and in those private moments, Illyra allowed herself to believe, just a little, that perhaps this impossible fairy tale might actually hold together. She did not yet know how fragile that hope truly was, nor how quickly the ground beneath her happiness would begin to shift, as old secrets long buried beneath ash and smoke stirred awake, sensing that the true heir to the Wolf Realm's throne had finally, unknowingly, returned home. The morning of the wedding arrived colder than expected, a thin mist clinging to the palace gardens as attendants rushed to finish the final preparations. Elira stood in a private chamber high in the eastern tower, staring at her own reflection in a tall mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. The gown was pale silver, embroidered with tiny silver threads that caught the light like scattered frost, and her hair had been woven with small white flowers by attendants who worked with the careful precision of women terrified of displeasing their new mistress. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said Nora, a young maid who had become one of the few genuine friends Elira had made within the palace walls. Nora had joined the kitchen staff only a year before Elira, and the two had bonded quickly over shared exhaustion and a mutual distrust of anyone who spoke too sweetly. "I feel like I might become one," Elira admitted, smoothing the front of her gown with hands that would not stop trembling. "Nora, what if I'm making a terrible mistake? What if the whole court is right, and I'm nothing more than a servant, playing dress-up in a queen's clothing?" Nora took her by the shoulders, forcing Elira to meet her eyes in the mirror's reflection. "The king chose you, Elira. Not some noble's daughter with a fancy family tree, but you. He's blind, not foolish. If anything, being blind means he sees people more clearly than anyone else in this whole palace, because he can't be fooled by pretty faces and expensive jewelry. He chose your heart, and that counts for more than any bloodline." Elira wanted desperately to believe that, and for a moment, standing there in her wedding finery, she almost did. But, beneath the surface of her nerves lay something else entirely, something she couldn't quite name or explain, a persistent, quiet ache that had grown steadily worse over the past several weeks. Sometimes, when she passed certain paintings in the palace hallways, old portraits of past rulers whose faces had been damaged or removed after the coup, her chest would tighten unexpectedly, as though some part of her recognized something the rest of her mind could not. She had told no one about these strange feelings, not even Draven, partly because she didn't understand them herself, and partly because she feared that speaking them aloud might somehow make them real in a way she wasn't prepared to face. The wedding ceremony itself took place in the grand hall of Emberfall, beneath ancient banners depicting wolves howling at a crescent moon, banners that had flown over this same hall for generations of rulers before Draven. Elira walked down the aisle alone, having no family to escort her, though Bettina had insisted on standing near the front row, beaming with pride as though Elira were her own daughter. Draven waited at the end of the aisle, dressed in formal dark robes trimmed with silver, his sightless eyes fixed steadily forward, guided only by the sound of her approaching footsteps and the scent that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. When she finally reached him, he reached out and found her hand without hesitation, his fingers wrapping around hers with quiet certainty. "You're shaking," he murmured, too soft for anyone else to hear. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Don't be," he said. "Whatever happens after today, know that I chose this. I chose you." The ceremony proceeded with traditional wolf vows, promises spoken in the old tongue that bound not just two people but two fates together, sealed with the exchange of matching silver rings engraved with a howling wolf beneath a crescent moon, an old symbol of the royal bloodline that neither Draven nor Elira realized held any special significance to her at all. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, king and queen, the grand hall erupted into applause, though Elira noticed, even amid the celebration, a scattering of noble faces that remained stone-cold and unmoved, watching her with calculating eyes that promised trouble yet to come. That night, alone with Draven in the royal chambers for the first time as his wife, Elira found herself overwhelmed by an unexpected wave of guilt she couldn't explain, tears spilling before she even realized she was crying. "What's wrong?" Draven asked immediately, his hand finding her cheek and feeling the wetness there. "I don't know," Elira admitted honestly. "I feel like I'm deceiving you somehow, though I don't understand what I could possibly be hiding. I have no secrets, no hidden fortune, no noble family waiting to be revealed. I'm exactly what I appear to be, a poor orphan girl who somehow ended up married to a king, and yet something inside me feels like a lie, like I'm wearing a costume that doesn't quite fit." Draven pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her with a gentleness that belied his fearsome reputation. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, You feel that way because you've spent your entire life being told you were nothing, and now suddenly you're expected to be everything. That kind of change would unsettle anyone, Elira, regardless of what secrets they may or may not carry. His explanation made sense, logically, and Elira wanted badly to accept it. But as she drifted toward sleep that night, curled against her new husband in a bed far grander than anything she had ever imagined sleeping in, her dreams filled with fragments she couldn't quite hold on to, the smell of smoke, the sound of a woman's voice singing softly in a language she somehow understood, despite never having learned it, and the fleeting image of golden eyes staring back at her from a burning window. She woke gasping, her hand instinctively pressed against the small silver mark just below her collarbone, a birthmark shaped, faintly like a crescent moon, that she had carried her entire life, and always assumed was nothing more than an odd quirk of skin. For the first time, staring down at it in the pale morning light, Elira wondered, with a chill that settled deep into her bones, whether that mark might mean something far more significant than she had ever allowed herself to consider. In the weeks that followed her wedding, Elira settled slowly into her new role as queen, though the transition proved far from smooth. Court etiquette overwhelmed her at every turn, unfamiliar rules about who could speak first, which fork belonged with which course, how to address visiting dignitaries from neighboring wolf territories. Lady Wynne, surprisingly, took it upon herself to guide Elira through the more confusing aspects of palace protocol, her sharp tongue softened by what appeared to be genuine, if reserved, approval of the young queen's efforts. "You're doing better than most nobly born brides manage in their first month," Lady Wynne told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the palace gardens Elira had once only described in words to a blind king who could not see them himself. "Most girls raised in luxury crumble under the weight of a crown. You seem to be growing stronger under it instead." "I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't enough," Elira replied honestly. "Perhaps that's made me stubborn enough to prove otherwise, even when I don't entirely believe it myself." Lady Wynne studied her for a long moment, with an expression Elira couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and quiet calculation. "You have an unusual bearing for a servant girl, if you don't mind me saying so. The way you carry yourself, the way you speak. It reminds me, oddly enough, of someone I knew a very long time ago." Elira's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Is that so? I couldn't say who that might be. I never knew my birth parents." "No," Lady Wynne said slowly, her gaze lingering just a moment too long on Elira's face, before she seemed to catch herself and looked away. "No, I don't suppose you would." The conversation ended there, but Elira carried an uneasy feeling with her for the rest of the day, a sense that something important had passed between them, that she didn't fully understand. Some recognition Lady Wynne had almost, but not quite, voiced aloud. It was not the last time someone would look at her with that particular expression of dawning, unspoken suspicion, and each time it happened, the strange, persistent ache beneath her collarbone seemed to grow just a little bit stronger, as though her own body was trying desperately to remind her of a truth her mind had long ago been forced to forget. Corwin Ashgrave had not risen to his position on the royal council through charm alone. He was a careful man, methodical in his ambitions, patient in ways that had served him well for over 2 decades. It had been Corwin, working quietly through hired blades and a handful of desperate allies, who orchestrated the coup that ended the old royal bloodline, though he had made certain, in the years since, that no evidence ever pointed back to his own hands. He had watched the old king die, had watched the palace burn, and had believed, with complete confidence, that every member of the royal family had perished that night, including the infant princess, whose body was never actually recovered from the ashes. For 20 years, that missing detail had not troubled him. Bodies burned in fires that hot were rarely found intact, and no one had ever come forward claiming to be the lost princess. No evidence had ever surfaced suggesting she had survived. Corwin had built his entire position within the new regime, on the assumption that the old bloodline was extinct, that Draven's rule, however inconvenient his blindness made him, would remain the only royal authority the Wolf Realm would ever know again, at least until Corwin found the right opportunity to seize more power for himself. The sudden appearance of Elira, a mysterious servant girl who had captured the king's heart so completely that he defied his entire council to marry her, unsettled Corwin more than he cared to admit. It wasn't merely her humble origins that bothered him, though that alone would have been enough to raise questions among the nobility. It was something else entirely. something he couldn't quite articulate until the day he finally saw her up close during a formal court gathering, and found himself staring, transfixed, at the shape of her eyes and the particular tilt of her jaw, features that stirred a memory buried so deep he had nearly convinced himself it didn't exist. She looked, Corwin realized with a jolt of ice down his spine, remarkably like the old queen. Not identical, not enough for anyone else to notice, unless they had known the queen personally, as Corwin himself had, decades ago before ambition curdled into betrayal. But the resemblance was there, undeniable once he allowed himself to truly see it, in the shape of her cheekbones, and the particular gold flecks that occasionally seemed to catch the light in her otherwise ordinary brown eyes. He told himself it was coincidence at first, a trick of his own guilty conscience finding ghosts where none existed. But Corwin had not survived decades of court politics by ignoring his instincts, and his instincts screamed that something about this servant-turned-queen was far more significant than anyone at court realized. He began his investigation quietly, careful never to draw attention to his own curiosity. He sent trusted men to the border villages, asking discreet questions about an orphan girl named Elira, tracing her history back through a chain of foster families and temporary guardians, until the trail finally led to a small village called Hollow Creek, where an elderly farmer, now long retired, recalled a strange detail from over 20 years ago. "A baby left on our neighbor's doorstep," the old farmer told Corwin's hired investigator, over cups of cheap ale in a village tavern. "Wrapped in fine cloth for a servant's child, though the family who found her were simple folk, nothing special about them at all. There was a coin left with her too, silver, marked with some kind of wolf symbol. The couple who raised her passed a few years later, sickness took them both, and the girl was passed around after that. Strange business, if you ask me, though nobody thought much of it at the time. Poor children turn up abandoned more often than anyone likes to admit." When the investigator relayed these details back to Corwin, his blood ran cold. A silver coin marked with a wolf symbol, left with an abandoned infant exactly 20 years ago, in a village close enough to Emberfall that a desperate nursemaid could have reached it on foot in a single night's flight from a burning palace. It was too precise, too deliberate, to dismiss as mere coincidence. Corwin spent several sleepless nights turning the possibility over in his mind, weighing his options with the same careful calculation that had guided every major decision of his political career. If Elira truly was the lost princess, thought dead for 20 years, her survival threatened everything Corwin had built. Draven's marriage to her, intended as nothing more than a personal choice made by a lonely blind king, would suddenly become something far more dangerous, a legitimate claim to the throne that superseded even Draven's own authority, should the truth ever come to light. Worse still, if Elira ever discovered what had truly happened the night her family was slaughtered, and who among the current council had orchestrated it, Corwin's own life would be forfeit the moment she understood. He could not allow that truth to surface. Whatever it took, whatever cost, Corwin decided he would ensure the secret of Elira's true identity remained buried, just as he had once believed her body to be buried beneath the ashes of the old palace nursery. His first attempt at removing the threat came disguised as caution rather than malice. Corwin approached Draven privately, expressing concern over the queen's mysterious past, suggesting that a formal investigation into her origins might be wise, purely for the sake of the realm's security, of course. Draven predictably refused outright, his loyalty to Elira unshakable regardless of her humble beginnings. "My wife's past does not concern this council," Draven told him firmly. "She is my queen, chosen by me, and that is the end of the matter." Rebuffed, but not deterred, Corwin turned to subtler methods. He began cultivating doubt among other council members, planting careful seeds of suspicion about the queen's unusual strength, her occasionally golden eyes that servants whispered about in hushed voices, her uncanny resemblance to portraits of the old royal family that still hung, half forgotten, in the palace's oldest wing. He knew better than to accuse her outright, without proof that could be traced back to his own involvement in the original coup. Instead, he waited, patient as ever, for an opportunity to eliminate the threat quietly, permanently, before anyone else could piece together the same terrible truth he had already uncovered. That opportunity arrived sooner than even Corwin anticipated, on a night when the full moon hung heavy and bright over Emberfall, and old magic, long dormant within Elira's blood, finally began to stir awake. The full moon rose over Emberfall, thick and golden, casting long silver shadows across the palace grounds, and Alira found herself unable to sleep, drawn instead to the balcony outside the royal chambers, where the cool night air seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't quite explain. Beside her, Draven slept peacefully, exhausted from a long day of council meetings that had grown increasingly tense in recent weeks, though he had shared little of the details with her, not wanting to burden his new wife with the weight of court politics so soon after their wedding. Alira leaned against the stone railing, watching moonlight ripple across the garden fountain below, and felt that familiar, persistent ache beneath her collarbone flare brighter than it ever had before. She pressed her hand against the small crescent-shaped mark, wondering, not for the first time, what it might mean, when a sound from the shadows below caught her attention. Quiet, deliberate footsteps that did not belong to any palace guard she recognized. She watched, frozen, as three cloaked figures moved silently through the garden toward the private entrance leading to the royal chambers, their movements too coordinated, too purposeful, to be innocent wanderers. Alira's heart raced as understanding dawned. Assassins, moving toward her sleeping husband with clear and deadly intent. She had no time to summon guards, no time to shout a warning that might not reach them fast enough. Instead, something deep within her, something ancient and long suppressed, surged forward with a force that stole the breath from her lungs. Her vision sharpened impossibly, colors growing vivid even in the darkness, and her body moved before her conscious mind had fully caught up, vaulting over the balcony railing with an ease that defied every physical limitation she had ever known. She landed among the startled assassins with a speed and strength that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, someone far more powerful than the poor servant girl she had always believed herself to be. The three intruders barely had time to register her presence before she moved through them with a fluid, ferocious grace, disarming the first before he could raise his blade, throwing the second bodily into the garden fountain with a force that sent water crashing over the stone edges, and pinning the third against the garden wall with a grip strong enough to make him cry out in genuine pain. Palace guards, alerted finally by the commotion, arrived moments later to find their queen standing amid the chaos, her eyes blazing an impossible brilliant gold in the moonlight, her chest heaving, as though she had just run for miles, though she had barely moved from the spot where the intruders now lay subdued and terrified before her. Draven, woken by the noise, stumbled onto the balcony, just as guards secured the captured assassins, his sightless eyes searching uselessly for information, his ears and nose scrambled to provide instead. "Alira?" he called out, his voice tight with alarm. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back, though her own voice sounded strange to her ears, distant and shaken. "I stopped them, Draven. I don't know how, but I stopped them." As the guards led the captured assassins away for questioning, and the immediate danger passed, Alira found herself overwhelmed by a flood of sensation, unlike anything she had ever experienced. Images crashed through her mind in rapid, disorienting succession, memories that could not possibly be her own, and yet felt more real than anything she had known in her 20 years of life. She saw a grand nursery decorated with soft blue and silver fabrics. She saw a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, singing a lullaby in a language that felt achingly familiar, despite never having been taught to her. She saw flames consuming that same nursery, heard screaming and the clash of steel, felt herself being carried through smoke-filled corridors in the arms of a woman whose face she somehow recognized as belonging to someone who loved her fiercely, someone named Mirella. Alira sank to her knees, amid the garden's scattered stones, her hands pressed against her temples, as the memories continued crashing over her like relentless waves, each one clearer and more devastating than the last. She saw the silver coin marked with a howling wolf, felt the weight of a spell being placed upon her tiny infant body, a spell meant to hide her, to protect her, to erase every trace of who she truly was. By the time Draven reached her side, guided by servants who had rushed to assist their disoriented queen, Alira was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face, as the full weight of the truth settled over her like a physical burden. "Alira, what's wrong?" Draven asked urgently, kneeling beside her and pulling her into his arms. "Talk to me. What happened out here?" "I remember," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Draven, I remember everything. The fire, the nursery, the woman who saved me. I'm not who I thought I was." I'm not just an orphan girl who got lucky enough to catch a king's attention. What are you saying? Draven asked, though something in his tone suggested he had already begun to suspect the answer, some instinct sharpened by years of blindness picking up on details his conscious mind hadn't yet fully assembled. Illyra pulled back just enough to look at him, though of course he could not see the golden intensity still lingering in her eyes, could not see the way moonlight caught the crescent-shaped mark, now glowing faintly beneath her collarbone, visible even through the fabric of her nightgown. I'm the lost princess, she said, the words feeling both impossible and undeniably true as she spoke them aloud for the first time. I'm the daughter of the king and queen who ruled before you, the ones who died in the Ember Coup 20 years ago. I survived, Draven. I've been alive this whole time, hidden, forgotten, raised as nothing more than a servant, while everyone believed the entire royal bloodline had been wiped out completely. For a long, terrible moment, Draven said nothing at all, his expression unreadable in the darkness, and Illyra's heart clenched with a fear far greater than anything the assassin's moments before had inspired in her. She feared, more than anything else in that instant, that this revelation might change everything between them, that the man who had chosen to marry a poor servant girl might not know how to love a princess, whose very existence threatened the stability of his entire reign. Say something, she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. Draven reached up slowly, his fingers finding her face with the same gentle certainty he had shown her that very first night in his study, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheek, as though relearning every feature now with entirely new understanding. All this time, he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion Illyra couldn't quite identify, I thought I chose to marry a servant girl out of nothing but love, defying every expectation placed upon me as king. But perhaps, he continued, some part of me always sensed there was more to you than anyone else could see. Blind as I am, perhaps my heart recognized what my eyes never could. Relief flooded through Illyra so intensely that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, though these were tears of a very different kind than before. You're not angry? Not afraid of what this means for your throne, for your council, for everything you've built? I am many things right now, Draven admitted honestly, confused, overwhelmed, uncertain about what comes next. But angry at you, Illyra? Never. If anything, I am angry on your behalf, angry that someone stole 20 years of your life from you, 20 years you should have spent knowing your own worth, your own true name, rather than believing yourself unwanted and unremarkable. They remained together in the garden long after the guards had cleared away, long after the captured assassins had been dragged off for questioning, simply holding each other beneath the fading moonlight, both of them grappling with a truth that would soon reshape not only their own lives, but the entire future of the wolf realm itself. Neither of them yet realized just how far the danger surrounding this revelation truly extended, nor how close that danger had already crept toward the heart of their own palace walls. The morning after the attack, interrogations of the captured assassins began in the palace's lower chambers, conducted by Draven's most trusted captain, a broad-shouldered warrior named Garrick, who had served the crown faithfully since before Draven's own coronation. Illyra insisted on being present, despite Draven's initial reluctance to expose her to the grim business of extracting information from men who had tried to kill him only hours before. I need to understand who sent them, Illyra said firmly, standing beside her husband, as Garrick prepared to question the first prisoner. If someone knows the truth about who I am, and that same someone wants Draven dead, then I have every right to hear what they know. Garrick, to his credit, needed little persuasion to extract answers from men who had already been thoroughly frightened by their unexpected defeat at the hands of a servant girl who apparently possessed the strength of a seasoned warrior. The first assassin, a wiry man with nervous eyes, broke quickly under pressure, confessing that he and his companions had been hired through an intermediary, paid handsomely to eliminate the king under cover of darkness, though he claimed ignorance regarding who exactly had commissioned the job. A go-between arranged everything, the man insisted, sweat beading on his forehead. We never met our employer directly, only received instructions and payment through a trusted courier. Describe this courier, Garrick demanded. The description that followed, though vague, contained enough specific detail, a distinctive limp, a scar along one side of the jaw, that Garrick immediately recognized the man as a known associate of Lord Corwin Ashgrave, someone who had served the councilman in various unofficial capacities for years. When this information reached Draven and Alira, the pieces of a much larger puzzle began falling into place with disturbing clarity. Corwin's persistent objections to Alira's mysterious background, his suspicious inquiries into her past that several servants had reported overhearing, his sudden and uncharacteristic insistence on additional palace security measures that conveniently reduced guard presence in certain areas of the grounds on the very night of the attack. All of it painted a portrait of a man with far more knowledge and far more guilt than his carefully composed public persona suggested. "He knows," Alira said quietly, once she and Draven were alone again, in the privacy of their chambers. "Corwin knows who I really am, and he's trying to eliminate the threat before I can claim what's rightfully mine." "Or eliminate me," Draven added grimly, "so that with my death and your identity still unknown, the throne would fall into chaos he could more easily manipulate to his own advantage." The question that followed occupied both of them long into the night, weighing heavily on every conversation over the following days. Should Alira's true identity be revealed publicly, exposing her to even greater danger from a man who had already proven willing to commit murder to protect his secrets? Or should the truth remain hidden, protecting her safety at the cost of denying her rightful claim to a heritage that had been stolen from her 20 years ago? "If we hide the truth," Draven reasoned, during one such conversation, pacing slowly across their private study, while Alira sat curled in a chair near the fireplace, "Corwin remains free to continue whatever scheme he's building. We'll be forever looking over our shoulders, waiting for his next attempt, never able to properly hold him accountable for what he did to your family all those years ago. But if we reveal it," Alira countered, "we hand him a reason to act even more desperately, more dangerously, than he already has. A cornered wolf is far more vicious than one who still believes he has time and options." They discussed strategy carefully, considering every angle, every possible consequence. Lady Wynne, when quietly consulted, confirmed what both of them had already begun to suspect, that she had recognized something of the old queen in Alira's features from the very beginning, though she had lacked sufficient proof to voice her suspicions openly. "I served under your mother's rule as a young councilwoman," Wynne admitted to Alira, during a private meeting, arranged away from prying eyes and listening ears. "She was fierce and kind, in equal measure, much like you've proven yourself to be, my queen. I always wondered, in the years following the coup, whether the official reports of the entire family's death told the complete truth. Bodies burned beyond recognition, in fires that intense, and no one ever found remains small enough to belong to an infant princess." "Will you support us?" Draven asked directly, "if we choose to reveal Alira's identity publicly?" Lady Wynne considered the question with the same careful deliberation she brought to every matter of state. "The realm deserves to know its rightful heir survived," she said finally. "And frankly, my king, this realm has grown weary of Corwin Ashgrave's increasing influence over council matters. Many of us have long suspected his ambitions extend beyond mere political advantage, though none of us possessed evidence strong enough to challenge him directly. If revealing the truth about your queen also serves to finally expose Corwin's treachery, then yes, you will have my full support." With Lady Wynne's backing secured, and additional quiet inquiries revealing several other council members who harbored similar long-standing suspicions about Corwin's role in the original coup, Draven and Alira made their decision. The truth would be revealed, publicly and completely, at the next full council gathering, forcing Corwin's hand before he could orchestrate any further attempts against either of their lives. Preparing for that confrontation required careful planning. Garrick quietly reinforced palace security, placing loyal guards in strategic positions throughout the council chamber and its surrounding corridors, while Lady Wynne worked to ensure that key council members sympathetic to the crown would be present and prepared to lend their voices in support once the revelation was made. Alira spent the days leading up to the confrontation practicing her newfound strength and abilities under Garrick's careful guidance, learning to control the surges of power that had first manifested so violently during the assassination attempt. She discovered, to her own surprise, a natural aptitude for combat that seemed to flow through her, as though it had always been there, simply waiting for the right moment to awaken fully. "Royal blood carries its own kind of memory," Garrick explained during one training session, watching Alira execute a complicated defensive maneuver with an ease that belied her lack of formal training. "Your body remembers what your mind forgot. Trust your instincts, my queen. They will not fail you when the moment comes." On the eve of the council meeting where everything would finally come to light, Illyra stood once again on the balcony where her powers had first awakened, watching moonlight play across the same garden fountain that had witnessed her transformation from frightened servant to something far more formidable. Draven joined her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting gently against the top of her head. "Are you frightened?" he asked softly. "Terrified," Illyra admitted honestly. "But also, strangely, more certain of who I am than I have ever felt in my entire life. Whatever happens tomorrow, Draven, I want you to know that meeting you, marrying you, none of that was a mistake, regardless of what secrets my blood carried all along." "I know," Draven said simply. "I've always known. Tomorrow, we simply let the rest of the realm discover what I recognized in you. From that very first night you brought me tea, and refused to be afraid of a blind king, everyone else treated like something fragile or broken." Together they watched the moon complete its slow arc across the night sky, both of them silently steeling themselves for the confrontation that awaited them at dawn, a confrontation that would determine not only their own future together, but the future of an entire realm, still recovering from wounds inflicted 20 years earlier, by a man who had never truly been held accountable for his crimes. The council chamber filled quickly that morning, every seat occupied by nobles who had been summoned with unusual urgency, their curious whispers filling the tall stone room like a swarm of restless insects. Corwin Ashgrave arrived among the last, his expression carefully composed into its usual mask of calm authority, though Garrick's guards had noted, with quiet satisfaction, the slight tension in the man's shoulders as he took his customary seat near the head of the table. Draven stood before the assembled council, Illyra at his side, dressed not in the soft, unassuming gowns she had worn throughout her brief tenure as queen, but in formal royal attire that echoed the styles worn by rulers generations past. Deep blue fabric, embroidered with silver thread, a subtle crescent moon pattern woven throughout the design, a choice Lady Wynne had suggested with quiet, deliberate purpose. "Members of this council," Draven began, his voice carrying easily throughout the chamber. 20 years ago, this realm suffered a devastating loss. Our former king and queen were murdered, their infant daughter believed to have perished alongside them, in the flames that consumed our palace nursery. Today, I stand before you to reveal a truth that changes everything we believed about that tragic night." Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles as Draven continued, his sightless eyes fixed steadily forward with unwavering confidence. "The infant princess did not die that night. She survived, hidden, and protected by a loyal servant who gave her own life, ensuring the child's safety. That princess grew up believing herself an ordinary orphan, unaware of her true heritage, until recent events forced the truth to finally surface." He turned slightly toward Illyra, extending his hand, which she took firmly despite the trembling nervousness she felt beneath her composed exterior. "My wife, your queen, is that lost princess. Illyra is the rightful heir to this throne, daughter of the king and queen who ruled before me, and the sole surviving member of our realm's original royal bloodline." The chamber erupted into chaos, shocked voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief, excitement, and in some corners, clear alarm. Through the noise, Corwin's voice rose sharply, cutting through the confusion with practiced authority. "This is preposterous," he declared, rising from his seat with theatrical outrage. "A convenient story indeed, conjured up just in time to solidify a servant girl's claim to power. Where is the proof of such an extraordinary assertion?" "The proof," Draven replied calmly, "lies in the birthmark she carries, identical to marks worn by every member of the royal bloodline for generations. A crescent moon beneath the collarbone, documented in the old family records that still exist within this very palace's archives. The proof lies also in abilities she has demonstrated, strength and instinct that belong only to those carrying true royal wolf blood. Abilities she displayed quite dramatically when she single-handedly defeated 3 trained assassins who attempted to murder me in my own garden merely days ago." At this, Corwin's carefully maintained composure flickered, just slightly, just long enough for those watching closely, Lady Wynne among them, to notice the brief flash of genuine alarm crossing his features. "Assassins," Corwin repeated, his voice tightening almost imperceptibly. "A troubling development certainly, though I fail to see how it relates to these wild claims about the Queen's parentage." "Perhaps," Illyra said, speaking for the first time, her voice steadier than she expected, because the courier, who arranged payment for those assassins, has already confessed his connection to you, Lord Ashgrave. Perhaps because you have spent recent weeks quietly investigating my background, sending men to my old village asking careful questions about an abandoned infant and a silver coin marked with a wolf's howl. Perhaps because you, more than anyone else in this chamber, have every reason to fear the truth of who I am, since you were the one who orchestrated the very coup that killed my parents 20 years ago. The accusation landed like a physical blow, and this time Corwin could not fully mask his reaction. His face paled, his hands clenched at his sides, and for a long, tense moment, the entire chamber held its breath, waiting to see how he would respond. Lies, Corwin finally spat, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Baseless accusations from a servant girl playing at royalty, supported by nothing more than convenient timing and wild speculation. Not entirely baseless, Lady Wynne interjected, rising from her own seat with quiet dignity. I have long harbored suspicions regarding certain irregularities from that terrible night, irregularities that always seem to point towards someone within our own court, rather than an external enemy, as was officially reported. Several of us have quietly compared notes in recent days, Corwin, and the pattern that emerges points directly toward you. One by one, other council members who had privately confided their own long-held suspicions to Lady Wynne began voicing their support, each testimony adding another crack to the foundation of Corwin's carefully constructed innocence. Garrick's guards, positioned strategically throughout the chamber exactly as planned, moved to secure the exits, ensuring no escape remained available for the increasingly desperate councilman. Recognizing that his careful web of deception had finally, irrevocably unraveled, Corwin's demeanor shifted abruptly from wounded innocence to open hostility. You think exposing me changes anything? He snarled, all pretense of civility abandoned. I built this council's current power structure from the ashes of that old regime. Half of you owe your positions to changes I orchestrated after that night. Do you truly believe restoring some forgotten princess to power serves any of your interests better than maintaining what we have already built together? Some of us, Lady Wynne replied coldly, value justice more than convenient power structures built upon murdered innocents, Corwin. Your ambition cost this realm its rightful rulers, and countless lives beyond theirs in the chaos that followed. That debt has remained unpaid for 20 years. Today, it finally comes due. Cornered and desperate, Corwin made one final, reckless gambit, lunging suddenly toward a hidden blade concealed within his formal robes, aiming not for Draven, whom he correctly assessed would be heavily protected, but for Alira herself, believing perhaps that eliminating the newly revealed princess would somehow salvage his crumbling position. But Alira's instincts, sharpened through days of training with Garrick and fully awakened now to her true heritage, responded before conscious thought could even form. She moved with a speed that seemed to blur the space between them, intercepting Corwin's attack and disarming him with the same fluid, ferocious grace she had displayed against the assassins in the garden, pinning the older man against the council table with a strength that left absolutely no doubt remaining about her royal wolf blood. It's over, Corwin, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Your secrets, your schemes, all of it ends today. Guards rushed forward to properly restrain the defeated councilman, dragging him away amid a chamber now filled not with chaos, but with a strange, settling quiet, as the assembled nobles processed the full weight of everything they had just witnessed. Justice, delayed for 20 long years, had finally caught up with the man responsible for so much loss and suffering. In the weeks that followed Corwin's arrest and subsequent trial, evidence continued mounting against him, confirmed testimony from co-conspirators, desperate to save themselves by exposing his central role in the original coup, along with corroborating details that painted a complete picture of his 20-year deception. The realm, rather than plunging into the chaos Corwin had predicted, instead rallied around their newly revealed princess with an enthusiasm that surprised even Draven, who had worried, privately, about how thoroughly the nobility might resist such an unprecedented development. The common folk, upon hearing the full story, embraced Alira's return with genuine joy, celebrating throughout Emberfall's streets for days, drawn to the romantic narrative of a lost princess raised in poverty, unknowingly finding her way back home through love, rather than force or political maneuvering. Even many nobles who had initially doubted her claim found themselves won over by her evident strength of character, her natural aptitude for leadership, and the clear, unwavering devotion between her and the king, a devotion that had, after all, proven strong enough to survive an upheaval that would have shattered lesser bonds entirely. A second, more formal ceremony was arranged, distinct from their original wedding, a coronation befitting Illyra's true station, as both queen and rightful princess of the Wolf Realm's ancient bloodline. Standing once more in the grand hall beneath those same ancient banners depicting wolves howling at a crescent moon, Illyra felt none of the trembling uncertainty that had plagued her during her first wedding ceremony months earlier. This time, she stood tall and certain, fully aware of exactly who she was and exactly what she had fought to reclaim. As the crown, an heirloom recovered from the palace's oldest archives, one that had belonged to her own mother generations before the coup, was placed carefully upon her head, Illyra looked toward Draven, whose sightless eyes nonetheless seemed to shine with pride and love in equal measure. "You saw me," she whispered, leaning close enough that only he could hear her words, before anyone else in this entire realm ever bothered to look. "I didn't need my eyes," Draven replied softly, his hand finding hers with the same gentle certainty he had shown her from their very first meeting. "I only ever needed my heart, and it recognized you as my equal, my queen, and my true partner, long before either of us understood exactly how deeply that truth ran." Together, hand in hand, the blind king and his rightful queen turned to face their assembled court, their people, and their future, ready to rule the Wolf Realm not through fear or forced convenience, but through the same honest, unwavering love that had first brought them together in a quiet study, over nothing more than a simple cup of tea, and an honesty that neither of them had expected to find in each other, but that both of them, in the end, had needed more than either could have ever imagined.